The final time period of the Greek era is the Hellenistic, and this is the longest, right, of their time periods, and this is the time of disillusion, right? This is the time when they start to break down as a culture a bit. But it's one of my favorite times for art. And I think, one of the reasons why is because it's a very free time period. They had become much more international, less xenophobic at this time. They were a lot more open to outsiders. They had actually expanded into areas like Turkey with cities like Pergamon, into Egypt with cities like Alexandria. So they had become a little bit more international, a little bit more cosmopolitan, and a little bit more open, right, to other people and other cultures and other ideas. But this is when they start to decline. At the end of this time period, of course, they'll start to be absorbed by the Romans, and the Greeks, in a sense, will start to lose their cultural cohesion. And the two things that I always really point out with Hellenistic art are it's very theatrical, very dramatic. So you get a sense of almost like these are stories that are worthy of being on a stage or having a movie made out of them. So that's one aspect of the Hellenistic I always stress. And that also there's a lot of sexuality in these pieces. There's a very, very sexy sort of attitude in a lot of them, which I don't think you see in a lot of art, period, in any of the time periods, any of the cultures. There's not usually a lot of open focus on sexuality, but you find it here in the Hellenistic, and I think that's very unique, and something worth talking about. The first thing we're going to focus on, though, is the theatrical side, and then we'll finish off talking about the sexuality and how it pans out in the art. Now, I'm showing you here a piece called The Dying Gaul and His Wife, and the Dying Gauls were actually what we call a type. Where this is not the only unique statue of this subject, where you see other ones as well that played with this theme. But what is a Gaul? A Gaul was a person from the area today that was like Germany and France, so Northern Europe, north of Greece. And this was a people that the Greeks were fighting. So they were enemies in a sense, or outsiders. So that is the idea of a Gaul. And how can you identify that they're Gauls? First off, you can see the hairstyle, this sort of bushy hair. And then they often were wearing these necklaces around their necks made of braided gold that we call torques. The hairstyle is obviously much, much easier to see. So I always point to that as what you should really be looking for when you're like, well, how can I tell it's a Gaul, right? But again, this is a sculpture that's being made to celebrate the military conflict between the Gauls and the Greeks. And what I always think is interesting about it is that because of the focus on drama in the Hellenistic, you see this as sort of this over-the-top kind of piece, where I think in the classical they would not have made a sculpture of an outsider in the first place, and they certainly wouldn't have celebrated it in such a dramatic way. Now, even though this Gaul looks very strong, very buff, very tough, you'll notice he's actually committing suicide. And this was very common for this time period and also into the Roman time period, that if a soldier was faced with being taken as a prisoner, they usually would have picked to kill themselves. It was considered the more honorable death than becoming a slave, becoming someone's property, a prisoner in any kind of way. So we may be like, what? But this is what they did. Romans, if they were backed into a corner politically, were shamed in some way, would often kill themselves. So it's very, very common behavior, right, for them to take their own lives if they felt that they couldn't survive. It was considered more honorable. Notice that before he takes his life, he's killed his wife because he knows her fate would be much worse as a prisoner. She would probably become a prostitute. Be used sexually. So he's taking care of her first, and then he's killing himself. I mean, this is a very, very dramatic subject. And I love showing you these different views of it so you can get a sense that when you walked around it in this 3D kind of way, it was just such a theatrical piece. It really sort of plays out as you move around the sculpture to make you have this emotive reaction to it. So the Greeks, even though these people were their enemies, are obviously showing them a lot of honor, right, in a piece like this, and framing it in a very theatrical, right, type of manner. The idea of this kind of sacrifice. They're like, yes, you're our enemies, but you're a pretty amazing enemy, which makes us think, then who were the Greeks, right? They must have been even more amazing than these people. So it's honoring yourself through elevation. Your enemy is of high quality. That means you're of even higher quality, right? You're even harder to beat. So again, this is a really theatrical piece, I think, that plays with the idea of amping up the drama in a piece. And as I mentioned, these are a type of sculpture. So here's a different version of a dying Gaul theme, because again, it's not a unique sculpture. These were done in many different iterations because this was a popular theme of the time. Another statue that I think shows the theatricality angle really well is the Laocoon, or you also hear pronounced Laocoon. It really depends on how you're going to pronounce it. This is a piece that's in the Vatican collection today, and deals with the story of the Trojan War and the priest of Troy who wished to warn his city that invaders were coming. Don't trust that Trojan horse, right? Well, the gods did not want him to be able to warn the people of Troy, so he sent these sea serpents to kill him and his sons. Because the priesthood was typically something that was a family line affair. So if your father was a priest, you typically were a priest as well. You were trained in that discipline or that profession. So the gods don't want this priest to speak. They don't want him to deliver the warning, so they send these sea serpents to kill him, kill his sons. And I love the drama of this statue. And this is an original Greek marble, which, as I mentioned to you, is not usually very common. And if you think about the intricacy of the artists as they made this marble statue, how many different components and parts and freestanding pieces there are here, it's quite amazing to consider, the artistry that had to go into it. But this idea of these writhing snakes and these people trying to escape them, again, you almost feel like you're seeing a drama that could play out on a stage, right? That could take place on a stage set. I also wanted to mention just how the composition is done makes it theatrical as well. If you look at the piece, you'll notice it's asymmetrical. The priest is kind of on a diagonal, and that makes him an asymmetrical composition. Asymmetrical compositions are always about movement. If you go back and look at Critias' boy, you'll notice he's very symmetrical. He's straight up, straight down. He matches. There's no movement. So classicism to me is all about symmetry. It's about perfection. It's about stillness. And when I look at Hellenism, it's about asymmetry. It's about action. It's about motion. It's about energy. So again, it's a very different sort of setup or composition. And again, I tried to give you different shots of this statue. When I was at the Vatican, I tried to take pictures so you could see it from different angles to give you a true sense of as you move around the sculpture, there's different viewpoints, and it brings out more and more theatricality, more emotions, more, sort of angles to contemplate the sculpture on, which I think adds to the overall piece. Now we can move on to the Nike of Samothrace. And I like talking about the Nike of Samothrace because I think it helps to bridge the theatricality angle and the sexy angle. You can kind of see both subjects in it. This is a shot of the Nike at the Louvre, where it's presented in Paris. It's in the Louvre collection. Because of pop culture, you may have seen this recently in music videos and such. But I like the placement of it in the Louvre because it actually mimics the original placement of the statue. The statue was originally on the island of Samothrace, and it was said that the statue was placed in like this little grotto with like a waterfall behind the statue. So I always think that the steps almost mimic the idea of a waterfall kind of coming down. And if you know the story of the placement of the statue originally, you're sort of like, oh, that's so clever. It gives this sense of the water kind of behind it. So I love kind of thinking about that as far as how the Louvre presents it to you in the original placement. As I'd mentioned before, I'd tell you a little bit more about Nike. And Nikes were allegories of victory. Now, what is an allegory? It is a personification of an abstract concept. To personify something means to put it into human form. So an allegory is a personification of an abstract concept. What's an abstract concept? Love, hate, victory, justice. We know what they are, but you can't point to it on the street and say, there goes justice, These things are allegorical. You have to present them through symbolism. So an allegory is a personification of this abstract concept. It becomes symbolic that way. So Nikes were winged symbols of victory. So if you go back and look at Athena in the temple of Athena, right, the Parthenon, she's holding a Nike. She's holding a victory symbol in a sense. Here you're seeing the Nike again. If you've ever wondered why Nike uses a swoosh, it represents the wing on the winged symbol of victory, the Nike itself. And Nike's just a perversion of saying Nike in the Greek. So, as a sports company, they're about victory. So they use the symbolism, you'll notice, of the statuary and the Nike itself, right, to make their brand, essentially. It's pretty smart stuff. But she's a symbol of victory, and she actually was a symbol of victory at sea, naval victory. So again, she's set in this grotto with this waterfall, right? It all plays into this. Many people think she's the inspiration for the women on the front of ships. So if you've ever seen the front of a ship with like a woman, if you look at a big sailing ship from like the 1800s, right? You might be like, oh, okay, I get the sense here. And it even looks like the sea spray has gone up on her clothes to create what we call wet drapery, where we can see through the drapery. And this is why I would say this piece to me kind of bridges the gap between the theatrical and the sexual. It shows you kind of both, right, at the same time. Originally, the statue would have had a head. It's been lost to us through time. But, I actually think because it's an allegorical figure, it kind of actually works better this way. Because it's an abstract concept, it's not really meant to be a real person. And I love seeing it from both angles. Normally, you just see the beautiful shot on the left, from the front. But if you look at it from the side, you'll notice this theatricality of the action and the energy, which is such a hallmark of the Hellenistic kind of playing through. But as I mentioned, another big thing you can see when you look at Hellenism is the sexuality. Something like Venus de Milo. Venus is the Roman name for Aphrodite. So it's a little bit of a misnomer or a misnaming, but we forgive it. And the Venus de Milo is actually in the Louvre as well. So if you go behind, right, where the Nike of Samothrace is, you can find the Venus de Milo in the next room right behind. So they're in very close vicinity to one another, right, shown in that collection. The Venus de Milo, we don't really know what this statue is about, but because she's the goddess of love, we can make our assumptions. And the arms are gone, but we think that perhaps they were originally reaching for her garment, almost in this teasing kind of way, where her garment's about to slip down and she is just about to save it. So the sense of constant titillation, right, constant sense of you're about to see something more, but it never is going to happen. I very rarely see this in art, but you definitely see it here in the Hellenistic where there's a tease. There's kind of a sense of, oh my, what more is there to be served up to me? And I always kind of joke with my classes that, titillation or teasing is what people want. There's that famous phrase, you don't buy the cow when you get the milk for free. So, So, the sense of the tease, is what people go in for. The dressing up of sexuality, right? The sense of anticipation, that means a lot to people. That is part of the fun, So I think the Venus de Milo plays on that. There's also the famous Delos Aphrodite. This is one of my favorite statues. And I find it amusing because this statue would have actually been in a business house on the island of Delos. So my point being that these sculptures in the Hellenistic that were about sex, they weren't hidden, they weren't private, they were often very publicly shown, which again is quite unusual, but it's something that the Hellenistic people seem to enjoy for whatever reason. And in this piece you have Aphrodite and you have Pan, who is a thing of the forest, right? He hangs out with Dionysus. He's half man, half goat. And in the piece, he seems to be accosting Aphrodite, kind of like, hey, sexy, what are you doing? And she's holding up her shoe as if she's saying, you better not. But if you really think about it, it seems very playful. So again, this idea of sexuality as a tease or playfulness seems to run through a lot of Hellenistic artworks, where she doesn't seem too unduly threatened, and he doesn't seem like, he maybe thinks anything's really going to happen. He's just sort of like, hey, they're sexy, and she's like, oh, stop it, but they're both just kind of very lighthearted. The figure I always say does seem very much like get out of here is Cupid, Aphrodite's son, that you see sort of in the middle flying at Pan's horns and pushing him away, right? Like, no, get away from my mom. That's okay. But she seems to be very playful. He seems to be sort of playful. So I always like sort of this piece, is it seems to speak to human nature a bit and the playfulness of sexuality, especially if you watch people sort of out and about at a bar or something interacting with each other. There's often a lighthearted playfulness there. But Cupid seems to be saying, okay, though, if things go too far, I'm going to have to intervene here, right? And, I've talked to you before about comparative religion and different kind of symbols that you can see being changed over time. Many people think Cupid becomes like an angel, those little putti that you see in Renaissance paintings. And many people think Pan becomes the devil, the idea of the horns, that sort of a demonization of his character from being this guy who sort of runs around in the forest with Dionysus drinking and having fun to something negative. And the fact that he's a goat, many people talk about, if you look at like satanic symbolism, goats show up quite a bit, right, in sort of the darker arts after Christianization. A lot of people who look at this don't think that's accidental. So again, just thinking about some of these comparative religion items we've talked about, I think you can ponder a little bit of this when looking at the Delos Aphrodite, right, as well. But again, a lot of this is pretty blatant stuff, by the time you get to the end of the Hellenistic. And I think it's an interesting journey. If you look at Greek sculpture, starting in the Archaic, all the way to the Hellenistic, it changes, it grows, it progresses, they innovate. They create things like the contrapposto, the chiastic. They create systems that work for representation. They then kind of think about narrative and storytelling and how to work those things in as well. And so I think, the Greeks, their journey is all about change, progression, growth. And again, very different than like the Egyptians with the canon of proportions, who just keep doing the same thing for 3,000 years. Such a giant contrast, right, between those things. We're then going to be moving on now to look at the Etruscans briefly, and then talk about the Romans. And some of the things we talked about with the Greeks as far as mythology and such, we'll talk about how that applies to the Romans, because the Romans basically steal the Greek gods and rename them. But we'll also talk about how the Romans have a very different attitude to art culture. They do not have the same sense of innovation and creation that the Greeks have. They'll have more of a what can we take and what can we use attitude. So bear that in mind as we move on to our next discussions.